The child was born on a cold night when the wind howled against the thin wooden walls of their cabin, and the midwife who arrived said little. She had seen too much already in her years. Too many children born too close in blood, too many mothers too young and too frightened to understand what was happening. But this birth carried a weight heavier than most. When she placed the child in his mother's arms, she did not smile, she did not congratulate. She only looked at the brother, the father, the man standing in the corner with arms folded, and shook her head. The baby cried with a sound that seemed strained, weak, as if the air itself did not want to fill its lungs. Its eyes crossed before they opened fully, its jaw already too small for its face. Neighbors later claimed the child looked haunted, marked before it even had a name. But still, the girl who was both mother and aunt cradled it, whispering lullabies that were learned from the same childhood she had once shared with the man who made her pregnant. Her lullabies sounded more like apologies than songs. The brother, the so-called husband, saw the child differently. To him, it was proof that what he had done was not wrong, that life itself had confirmed his choice. In the twisted logic of isolation, he believed nature had allowed it, that God had permitted it, and so he carried himself as though the family they formed was no different from the others who built lives in the mountains. Yet those who caught glimpses of them knew. They saw the way people avoided looking too long at the child, the way church pews seemed to close ranks, leaving space where the family tried to sit. In Appalachia, whispers travel faster than rivers. But when it came to this man and his sister, whispers grew into curses. Some said the woods themselves turned darker near their home, that animals avoided the property, that the child's cries echoed strangely in the night. The family became ghosts while still alive, present yet unwelcome, breathing reminders of what should never be. And so the boy grew, surrounded by a silence thicker than any fog. His father was his uncle, his mother was his sister, and he himself was a symbol no one wanted to see, a symbol of what happens when blood is trapped in a circle with no way out. In the Appalachian Mountains, where the fog rolls heavy over valleys that time has forgotten, there exists a family history so disturbing that most locals refuse to even whisper about it. It begins with a man who was never meant to be known, a figure swallowed by the silence of the hills. He was not a villain in the stories people tell around firesides, nor a hero in the way towns carve their myths. He was something else, something unspeakable. He was a husband, but not to the woman most would expect. He was the husband of his own blood, the father of his sister's child, and the keeper of a secret that poisoned generations after him. To tell his story is to walk through the shadows of Appalachia's darkest corners, where hunger and isolation stripped away the boundaries most families cling to. The cabins were small, the winters cruel, and the line between kinship and survival blurred until the forbidden became reality. In these hills, love was often twisted by desperation, and he, this forgotten man, became the embodiment of that distortion. There are photographs that survive, but only fragments. Black and white portraits of hollow-eyed children, with jaws too narrow, gazes too vacant, limbs too thin. They carry the evidence of what was done long before their birth. And though the names have faded, the truth still clings like smoke in the rafters of abandoned homes. Imagine a girl, barely a woman, isolated by geography and silence. She trusted her brother because there was no one else. In a world where neighbors were hours away, where poverty swallowed whole futures, what began as reliance transformed into something else, something darker. And when her stomach swelled, the mountain folk looked away. Some claimed ignorance, others whispered that God himself had cursed their family, but no one intervened. This man, the brother turned husband, knew what he had done, and he wore no shame. In the folds of Appalachia, he was not the only one, but his story stands out, not because it was unique, but because the child born of that sin lived, and carried the scars into adulthood for all to see. Every secret begins with silence. His silence, her silence, the silence of neighbors who chose not to speak. But silence does not erase truth, it only buries it. And now, we dig it up again, piece by piece, bone by bone, to uncover what happened when blood turned inward and family ties became shackles. As the boy grew older, the silence around him became louder than words. He learned early that he was different. Not only in the way his body carried the marks of too close blood, his lopsided face, his slurred speech, his weak gait, but also in the way people looked at him. Children in the nearby settlement mocked him when he tried to play, and parents pulled their little ones back, whispering warnings that he was tainted. He didn't know what the word meant at first, but he felt its weight every time eyes turned away. Inside the cabin, the dynamic was stranger still. His sister mother, fragile and worn down by the shame she carried, tried to love him as any mother would. She sewed him clothes, combed his hair, and rocked him to sleep when he woke screaming in the night. But the guilt that festered in her heart was a constant reminder of the chain that bound her. Each time she looked at her son, she saw her brother in his face. She saw the crime made flesh. The brother-father, however, saw something else. To him, the boy was a legacy. His proof that nothing could stand against him, not even the laws of man or God. He paraded the child into town when supplies were needed, forcing the world to look at what he had made. He dared them to judge him, his eyes daring anyone to speak aloud what they all thought. Few had the courage. Most stayed silent, praying that whatever curse lingered in that family would not seep into their own. But Appalachia is a place where superstition and survival walk hand in hand. Some said the boy was born with the devil's mark. Others believed he was a punishment sent to remind the mountain folk of sins hidden in their own families. A local preacher once visited the cabin, clutching his Bible with trembling hands, urging the brother and sister to repent. But the brother laughed in his face, slamming the door and declaring that no man of God would undo what had already been done. The boy listened to all of it. He absorbed the shame, the fear, the half-spoken rumors. He grew into a child who did not laugh, who did not dream of the future. He became a shadow in his own life, walking proof of the family's sin, a living ghost bound to a story he never asked to inherit. By the time the boy reached his teenage years, the lines between secrecy and survival had nearly vanished. His body betrayed him in ways he could not hide. His jaw grew uneven, his teeth crowded, his speech thickened until words sounded half-broken. His gait remained unsteady, as if each step reminded him that he was not built like other children. But it wasn't just his appearance that set him apart. It was the way he carried the weight of knowing he was unwanted. In town, he was tolerated only as long as necessary. Storekeepers took his family's coins but avoided touching his hand. The blacksmith once muttered that the boy's eyes weren't right, claiming one wandered like it was searching for something the other couldn't see. And in churches, when hymns rose high into the rafters, his voice was drowned out by the silence around him. No one wanted to stand beside him. No one wanted to acknowledge the sin standing in flesh before them. Back at the cabin, the sister mother aged quickly, her body worn down by years of grief and silence. She often sat by the window, staring at the mountains, as if they might one day carry her away. Her son would place his hand on hers, but the comfort never reached her. She was trapped in a prison of her own making, half victim, half accomplice, and the boy was her eternal reminder. The brother-father grew harder with age, his face cut by lines of bitterness and defiance. He did not waver, did not flinch when confronted with whispers. Instead, he raised his son with an iron hand, demanding loyalty, obedience, and silence. To him, the boy was an heir, the proof that he could bend the rules of nature itself. And though the son never felt love in his father's touch, he obeyed. Fear and dependence bound him too tightly to ever resist. But isolation does not keep out the world forever. Rumors spread beyond the valley. Stories of a man who had taken his sister as wife began to circulate, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in disgust. Outsiders passing through the mountains asked about the family, their curiosity a knife twisting into the pride of the community. The locals wanted the story buried, but the truth leaked out like water through cracked stone. And for the boy, now on the edge of manhood, there was no escape. His blood tied him to a story that would never let him go. He was a living reminder that some sins do not die. They live on in faces, in names, in bones. There are stories that say the young man eventually tried to leave, though no one agrees on how far he made it. Some claim he walked down the narrow dirt road one night with nothing but a bundle of clothes and a single loaf of bread. Others whisper that he reached the edge of the county only to turn back when hunger and fear overtook him. In every version, the mountains themselves seem to drag him home, as if the land would not allow its darkest secret to escape. The father, now weathered and bitter, treated his son less like family and more like property. He insisted the boy had a duty to carry the bloodline forward. Some say he even encouraged him to repeat the same sin that had created him. That was the poison of this lineage. What began as desperation twisted into tradition, and what should have been condemned was instead passed down like inheritance. But the son was not his father. He carried the weight of shame, yes, but also the faint glimmer of resistance. Neighbors said they would sometimes find him lingering at the edge of town, staring at young people his own age with a look that was not lust, but longing, a hunger to belong, to be seen as human, to be touched by someone not bound to him in blood. It was a hunger his father would never understand. When the father died, the son was left alone in that cabin. The silence that followed was heavier than any cruelty he had endured. He was the last witness to his own making, the final keeper of a secret that no one wanted to hear but everyone already knew. Alone, he wandered the mountains, his figure spotted on ridgelines like a ghost moving against the tree line. Some said he went mad, mumbling to himself, clutching at shadows. Others believed he simply faded away, swallowed by the same hills that had cursed him from birth. What is certain is this: his bloodline ended with him. There were no children to inherit his face, no descendants to carry the mark. The cycle, twisted and cruel, finally broke, not by repentance, not by justice, but by the slow erasure of time. His cabin collapsed, his name was buried, and the woods grew thick over the ground where he once stood. But the story remained, passed in whispers, carried in fragments, haunting Appalachia like a wound that never healed. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have turned away in silence like the neighbors, or tried to break the chain before it was too late? The truth is, the boy never had a choice. The mountains had already written his fate long before he could read or write his own name. By the time he became a man, the world outside seemed more like myth than reality. Roads existed, yes, but they might as well have been oceans. Poverty kept them bound, shame kept them hidden, and blood kept them chained together in a cycle that would not break. The sister mother, frail and haunted, aged beyond her years. Her health declined quickly, her body too fragile to bear the weight of her guilt and her silence. Neighbors claimed she spoke less and less, that her eyes turned hollow, as if she lived in another world entirely. When she died, the cabin seemed to grow colder, darker, and the boy, now a young man, was left with only his father-uncle. It was then that the whispers grew louder, sharper, more venomous. Without the sister to shield him, the son stood alone in the eyes of the community. They saw his twisted features, his vacant stare, and they did not see a man. They saw a curse made flesh. Some would not even say his name. The father wore his defiance like armor, walking into town with his son at his side, daring anyone to speak. But pride is a heavy burden, and over the years it hardened him into cruelty. He demanded obedience not just from his son, but from the world around him. He would drink, he would rage, and he would remind his son again and again that his blood was all he had, and all he would ever need. But inside the boy, something stirred. A quiet longing, a recognition that his life, his very existence, was built on a secret that was never meant to be. He began to woo. And if there was more beyond the ridges and valleys, if there were places where no one knew his face, where his name was not a curse, And yet, in Appalachia, escape is easier to imagine than to achieve. For every step away, the mountains seem to pull tighter, their silence louder than ever. Time has a way of burying sins, but not erasing them. In Appalachia, the cabin where it all began has long since rotted into the soil, its timbers sinking into moss, its hearth cold for decades. Yet the story still lingers, told in fragments around kitchen tables and over fading campfires. The locals don't speak his name, but they remember. They remember the man who made his sister pregnant. They remember the boy born as both son and nephew, living proof of what happens when bloodline turns inward. The tale endures not because it is unique, but because it is emblematic of something larger, something older than even the mountains themselves. Desperation, poverty, isolation, they bend people in ways that break morality. And in those hidden hollows of America, where law and church often arrived too late, families sometimes turned on themselves, and shame became inheritance. The brother who became a husband was not the first, and he was not the last. But he remains the most infamous, the one whose shadow grew too dark to ignore. When people today hear this story, they often recoil, insisting it must be myth, exaggeration, rumor twisted by generations. But photographs remain, blurred images of faces that do not lie, jawlines too narrow, eyes too crossed, bodies too frail, evidence not written in ink but carved into flesh. These descendants became walking archives of sin, testaments to choices that should never have been made, and though the line has ended, the photographs are enough to remind us what was once hidden still breathes through history. The mountains hold many secrets, but none as heavy as this. For every valley is filled with graves, some marked, some forgotten, and beneath each stone lies a story untold. But the story of the man who fathered his sister's child is one the land refuses to forget. His ghost lives not in legends or songs, but in the quiet horror that runs down the spine when the name Appalachia is whispered with a certain weight. And so we close the book not with comfort but with unease, because the past is never truly past. It waits, it lingers, and it teaches us that silence does not protect, it only delays the reckoning. Some sins are too heavy to remain buried. Some sins rise again in stories like this one.